Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Henry Scoop Jackson was a Cold War hawk, veteran of the US Congress, always pushing for more weapons, more war, and for a long time harboured a raft of anti-Semitic views. Yet when the British neocons were casting around for a peg to hang their top hats on, they oddly fastened upon the obscure and largely forgotten Henry Jackson. Now turbocharged with pro-Israel fervour and anti-Islamist fanaticism, the HJS has become the font of some of the most poisonous right-wing agitation in this country.
A group of British academics, together with the Cordoba Foundation, have recently published chapter and verse about the go-to guys for a witch hunt.
We're joined by the CEO of the Cordoba Foundation, the redoubtable Anas Altikriti. Anas, welcome.
It's a pleasure,
Tell
George.
the public, if you would, about the Henry Jackson Society. I know about them and hate them so much. I'm not a dispassionate commentator on it. So better if you sum them up, please.
Well, first of all, George, Gayatri, thank you for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure. You know, as you put and ignoble failures of neoconservatives on every single level, whether it be on home fronts in the United States, in the United Kingdom, throughout Europe, or in their ventures abroad, such as in Iraq and elsewhere, we're still talking about them. And the reason is, and this is what we attempt to do in the report, we attempt to uncover exactly what the Henry Jackson Society stands for, who funds it, who stands behind it, who is linked to it, who is part of the structure whom they present from time to time that gives you and I the aura that there are so many out there who are against us. Actually, it's not so many. They all belong to the very same basket, and the basket is the Henry Jackson Society.
On the face of it, you see, you'd think such people wouldn't be able to show face in public.
You'd think so.
The anti-terrorism agenda that they drove through has led to more terrorism. The war in Iraq has turned into almost an apocalypse. It's almost impossible to overstate the size of the disaster. The neoconservative Bush and Blair years now look incredibly toxic to anyone.
Even the right wing,
yes.
They want nothing to do with either Bush or Blair.
But these people are just as ebullient as ever, and just as acerbic, acidic, actually, as ever. Where do they get the gall?
Well, they're driven by two main things, I believe. The first is an ideology. They are very, very much ideologues, despite them coming from various backgrounds, political, media, business, trade, some of them education, some of them health, military or the such. But ultimately, they all believe deeply in the neoconservative message. That's very, very important, by the way, because you and I know, I mean, we can stand a politician whom we disagree with. We can, disagree with anyone on any other issue, and usually you'd win that particular argument. But when you have an ideologue, as we do have in even our government of today, we have ideologues, not politicians, that is where things turn, as you put it, acidic. The other element is finance. They have a lot of it. They have huge backings, and we're talking about corporations worth tens of millions. We're talking about a structure of organizations. If you were to put them all together in one pot, they would be worth billions, several billions actually. And the interesting thing is this, time and time and time again, whilst the names are, you know, if you wish, the who's who of general right-wing, sometimes even far-right-wing policies and economic and social spheres and the such, in the UK and in America, ultimately, and this is what we find time and time again in the report, the thread always leads back to Tel Aviv.
And they never give up. Their Trojan horse fiasco was another disaster for them in the sense that it was debunked as a forgery.
But still they speak of it.
But still they speak of it.
They trump it. They flaunt it.
Yes.
It's as though they have no shame. But that's the ideologue.
I doubt if the money's come. I've not got to the section on finance yet, but I'm guessing that the money doesn't come from Tel Aviv, though the inspiration does. Isn't the money American money mainly?
Yes, very, very much so.
Corporations,
But it's usually people who are interlinked with either the Zionist foundations here in the UK, in America, AIPAC. Very, very, very strongly features in this report. It's about people who visit Israel quite a lot. They take that kind of emotional and ideological fuel from, you know, every now and then, and they're leading the charge. So, you know, Israel figures quite prominently in the whole operation.
Certainly, Israel is one of their, if you like, sacred cows. It's an article of faith for neoconservatism. Yes. And that much is clear from the report. How much of a two-way street it is, I'll wait till I get to it. Because my take on Israel is that they take other people's money rather than give people money. But I could be wrong about that. But the scale of the penetration of British civil society by these people is very, very large. They have members in the cabinet. They have somebody on the question time panel every other week. They are dragged out every time there's an issue or an incident. They have to have their point of view, and yet they represent a very tiny fraction of British public opinion.
Very tiny in numbers. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Very tiny. If you were to draw a map, we'd be the vast majority, and they would be, you know, the dot that's, you know, is there somewhere. But in terms of influence, in terms of where they are, where they stand, the reach, the finances, it's really scary. And the thing is that these people, because of the leverage that they wield, whether it be political or financial or otherwise, they know how to play this game. And therefore, in recent years, they've even gone to the extent of establishing so-called Muslim organizations, but who serve that particular agenda. You know, who am I to speak? I mean, there's a Muslim with a beard, you know, a sheikh, no less, who speaks, you know, in those particular those particular terms. So who am I to disagree with someone who's more knowledgeable of the such? They're very, very good at that. And, you know, in the UK, one of their biggest components that has done so much damage over the years for everyone, not just for the Muslim community, for everyone, is, for instance, the Foundation. You know, propped up as the foremost counter-extremism, counter-radicalization organization led by Muslims, with a Muslim cleric somewhere sitting, but serving an agenda that has nothing to do with most of us. One
might describe them as a kind of Trojan horse.
One might, absolutely.
A few episodes ago, we spoke about Uber, which is a $50 billion corporation from the US, and they pay actually people to work online to push their business. So is that also a platform for the Henry Jackson Society?
Of course.
Or is
social media is extremely important to them, and they realize that social media today looms, you know, it plays probably a far larger role than the mainstream media, than the BBCs of this world, the Skies or ITVs or the such. And there are tens of thousands, this is a very, very conservative estimate, tens of thousands of whom immediately go on the attack. And that's why, you know, we post an article where we're presenting an idea, you know, why don't we think about humanity, about, you know, how peace really should look like, something like that, on those particular lines. And we're inundated. It's like a hammer comes in from everywhere. And it's those troops that they have at the ready, at the click of a button.
Well, look, this raises the $64,000 question, as the Americans used to call it. How come they're so good at it and we're so bad? How come they can construct such a, on the right at least, hegemonic project, whilst we're two men and a dog handing out cyclo-style leaflets outside tube stations?
Listen, George, you're right. It is the question. And I have to say, we actually did a launch at the University of Bath with the authors of the report, the 4 authors, and they're a brilliant team. You know, Spinwatch is an organization that I invite everyone to go and look up, because they are doing investigative, not journalism, but investigative reporting and research that really matters to each and every one of us on a sterling scale. Now, their leader, Professor David Miller from the University of Bath, he said something which, you know, resonates with what you've just asked. He said, if nothing else, you have to give them credit for their tenacity and for their level of organization and dedication. It's true. you know, since we're right and they are so wrong, why is it that we can't organize? I think we can. I think we can. I think we do ourselves a lot of discredit when, you know, we think of ourselves in low terms. I think we're better than that. We're much, much better than that. We just need a little bit of organization. Plus, I think that these reports help to let people know exactly what's out there so that they can then mobilize to react and to counter.
Well, we now have an election coming up with Jeb Bush likely facing Hillary Clinton.
Again.
As Henry Kissinger once said in another context, it's a pity both can't lose. But one of them is going to win. Yes. And both are neocons, essentially.
Correct.
So they're not going away anytime. So this report is going to be an essential reading.
On this point, George, whilst you're absolutely right that the power is mind-boggling, if you wish, if you look at it, I mean, it sort of fills you with dread as to how much power they levy. But just let me point to one thing. One of the major proponents and organizations that make up the Henry Jackson Society is a very, very much openly declared Zionist federation and organization. Up until recently, it was given that any prime minister who came to become prime minister of Britain would be one of the patrons. And therefore, just a few years ago, that particular organization had not only the prime minister, by the way, but the leaders of all the major parties as patrons. Today, we stand with that organization having none of the leaders of the main parties, nor even David Cameron, the prime minister, as patrons. So you see, there is some sort of backdraw, and we need to capitalize on that. Now, whether that's because people are realizing that this is a losing game, or whether they're realizing that rather than this being an asset, it's more of a liability, I think it's something for us to pay attention to.
Food for thought. The report is outstanding. Everyone should get themselves a copy of it. Anas Altikriti, thanks as always for coming on board the Sputnik.
After a short break, one of Britain's growing number of independent investigative journalists, Mark Watts. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Sputnik. As the British print and even mainstream television media market continues to shrink, so does any nascent ambition they might have had to expose the rich and the powerful. That's increasingly left to the likes of WikiLeaks and our next guest, Mark Watts of Exaro News, who are filling the space where honest journalism used to be, maybe, in Fleet Street. Mark Watts, welcome to the Sputnik. Tell us first, what happened to the mainstream media that left a gap that Exaro is admirably filling?
Well, I think actually we can largely blame accountants, because accountants were saying in most media companies that we don't need this investigative journalism. It's incredibly labour intensive, it requires a lot of work, and it's just troublesome. And moreover, they said, we can just rewrite wire copy from Press Association, Associated Press, Reuters and so on. Just rewrite wire copy and press releases. It's very cheap to do, and we get lots of column inches for not so much money. And the problem is, the readers and the viewers are not interested in this guff. And if you look back at the stories that have really galvanised people, that have been dug up by journalists, it's always the investigative ones. And I wouldn't write off the mainstream media completely on this score. They occasionally have, little bursts of activity in this area. We had, before Exaro came into existence, the MP's expenses scandal exposed by the Telegraph,
sure,
which was a good piece of work and well executed. Yeah. But overall, there's less and less willingness to tackle, as you put it, the rich and powerful.
Now, once upon a time, we remember it, those of us of a certain age anyway, the Sunday Times, Insight Team, and so on. But the big stories of today are increasingly being led by you. In particular, the paedophile stories, the rich and powerful, and the ring that may or may not have existed around Westminster and Whitehall, and the clubs adjacent. Why have they been so quiet on this? Is it accountancy, or is it because they're part of the same establishment?
I think it's a bit of both. And I think one of the aspects of this scandal that we're uncovering here is the failure of the media to have tackled this story. And this is not a recent failure. This is not just recently when newspapers had less willingness to do investigative journalism. This goes back decades. Now, Exaro was formed to, as we put it, hold power to account. We've done a whole series of stories about a whole series of subjects. We revealed civil servants, senior civil servants working off payroll, a useful mechanism if you want to minimize tax. We revealed an extraordinary recording of Rupert Murdoch talking to a group of his journalists about how he knew all about the practice of bribery that had been going on at the News of the World in particular, right from when he bought it. So he was aware of the practice. But one of the investigations that we've done actually over about 3 years and still continuing is what we call the Westminster Paedophile Network. And this really gets to the root of how power in Britain works. And the media has shown precious little interest in exposing that in the past.
Not just the media, of course, but the prosecutorial authorities. The government has made a terrible hash of the inquiry that they set up, losing not one but two heads of that inquiry. The very controversial decision, not entirely closed yet, I think, not to prosecute Lord Janner.
Can say what we know is that there was multiple child sex abuse perpetuated by very powerful people in the British establishment, and there were multiple failures to police this, to prosecute this, or to expose it in any way, shape or form. So it's multiple failures on the part of the police, the entire criminal justice system, the government, and yes, the media. And what we're doing really at Exaro by the stories that we've uncovered is we're forcing the authorities in the same way as we're in fact forcing the mainstream media to tackle this subject. This is undoubtedly the biggest political scandal in post-war Britain.
This story would be nowhere as important as it now is, and it still has a long way to go to match its importance if it were not for Exaro and people like you. Have you felt the hot breath of the establishment in any way on the back of your neck as you nosed around on this story?
Yes, we're certainly aware of some skullduggery, shall we say, here and there. We've been very alive to it, and so far we've managed to navigate what is a very, very difficult story. I mean, you know, the people who are affected is utterly traumatic for them and remains so, even if it's many years, even decades after their abuse. We talk to many whistleblowers from the police, for example, and criminal justice system.
Many honest coppers did try.
Absolutely.
And were lent on from above.
And that's a big part of this scandal. And of course, they're desperate for the truth to be known, actually. In reality, there's a kind of symmetry here between journalists and police officers. Quite often, they want to do the proper job, but somehow someone more senior than them stops them.
Now, so far, we've established at least credible allegations that there were people in Downing Street, there were people in the House of Commons, there were people in the House of Lords, there were people in the British Diplomatic Corps, others in the civil service more generally. Even some judges and police officers have begun to pop into this frame. Is this something peculiar? I choose the word carefully. Is this something peculiar to the British ruling class? Why would such powerful people take such terrifying risks?
We don't know all the answers to these questions, and that is a question that is sort of begging there. And we don't know the answer to that. All we can do is uncover the evidence step by step, as we have done over 3 years. So we've put Britain in a position where even the authorities that have been so reluctant to act in the past have had to acknowledge the reality of this scandal. So we have had an overarching inquiry commissioned because of the evidence that we had raised. We have had the police open up a whole series of investigations specifically into prominent people and paedophilia. We have had the IPCC, which regulates the police here in Britain, say that they're looking at at least 17, the number keeps going up, at least 17 separate cases of corruption, and that's their word, of cases where they believe there have been cover-ups, where police operations were closed. And we've spoken to people who are involved in some of those operations, and it happened. That is absolutely what happened.
Just a general, back off the topic, question that I was pondering about after seeing this meme titled "Investigative Journalism Today," and you see a man behind the computer on social media. It was mocked, but I was wondering to what extent it does reflect today's journalism, and it is part of investigative journalism. Because if you think about investigative journalism, you think of All President Man. Was that the film with Dustin Hoffman?
That's what you imagined all journalists would have wanted to be.
Exactly.
But now it turns out they were getting their stories from hacking the telephone messages of celebrities and following social media.
Yes, but there was a lot of that going on in Fleet Street, or they've all departed Fleet Street. We're left in Fleet Street. We're the only ones.
Fleet Street?
Yes,
How remarkable.
We're the only ones there.
Well, that's very
good,
totemic. Real journalism returns to Fleet Street.
But coming back to the social media point, I mean, social media is effectively a tool, which is actually very useful. It's a way that people might contact us, sources can come through us this way. It's a way of us amplifying, the stories that we're doing. And for example, I mentioned the overarching inquiry that happened. It happened because we did a series of stories, one, that exposed evidence. Two, some MPs, colleagues of yours, George, from the Labour Party, Conservative Party and Liberal Democrats, cross-party group, really decided we've got to do something about this, and we must have this overarching inquiry. Initial group of 7, and this mushroomed. Why did it mushroom? This was totally ignored by the mainstream media. It was Twitter. It was followers of us at Exaro News on Twitter that were just tweeting to us, shall we ask our MP whether they would join this? And we said, well, if you want to, it's up to you. And they did, in quite large numbers. And we know that MPs were somewhat bombarded by, will you join? Will you sign up to this letter? And we had, I think, by the end, about 146 MPs in pretty quick time saying, yes, we want this overarching inquiry. And that is what forced Theresa May, the Home Secretary, to order it against a very, very reluctant David Cameron.
Mark, you made a very portentous statement, which I'm still chewing over, and I think you're right. This is the biggest scandal in Britain since the war, I think you said. Not sure there were bigger ones before the war. And yet, the only people who've been outed are the dead or the Alzheimer sufferer who can't any longer be brought to justice. How long before real live names, still in politics in some cases, at least still in the Houses of Parliament, emerge, at least on your pages, if not on the mainstream?
Well, there is something that's holding us back on that particular score about naming those names who we haven't so far named. As a result of the work we've done, to a large extent, there are active criminal investigations going on, and we're talking to abuse survivors who are the key witnesses in those cases, and in some cases they only happened because those abuse survivors came to us first of all and then ended up speaking to the police, and the police took them to be credible, because obviously in the past people like that were often totally dismissed. And there are active live police investigations into a whole array of people, and we obviously do not want to do anything that could in any way damage the prospects of justice. So there are two things that we're seeking here. Exaro's role is to expose the truth, but there's a wider thing about justice. Now, I would say you can't get to justice without the truth, but certainly the people who are talking to us really want that end point to be reached. So we have to be very, very careful that we don't do anything that could damage that. And throughout the 3 years, we have very closely abided by that.
And in a word, will justice be done?
I'm hoping at least we'll get the truth.
Well, I don't have my hat on, but I take it off to you. Fantastic. Exaro News, Mark Watts, thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Thank you very much.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Henry Jackson Society. Who, what, why? Ricardo Picasso answers Just another neocon think tank to tide the government by, until Parliament finally becomes a great big one. Then what happened to investigative journalism? Warren Springthorpe says, the best are always ostracized for thinking outside the mainstream media. The rest are sheeple, just happy to kowtow to Murdoch and co. to fear loss. And that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik and on Facebook on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.